The National Assembly on Thursday, November 7, met for the first time after a 2-month recess. During the sitting, one of the most topical issues in Guyana was examined, the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering the Financing of Terrorism Amendment Bill. This particular issue saw a number of events unfolding in the House. First, you had the report of the Special Select Committee that was examining the bill. You had a petition from the Private Sector Commission, and of course you had the actual third reading of that bill. Joining me today to discuss the outcome of Thursday's sitting are Dr. Ashni Singh, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Madam Gail Teixeira, Presidential Advisor on Governance and the Government's Chief Whip in Parliament, and Mr. Ronald Webster, Chairman of the Private Sector Commission. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you.
Thursday's sitting was one, I think, that will go down in the history books as it relates to Guyana. I want to start first with the private sector petition, which was Mr. Mansour Nadir, the PPC MP, who would have taken that petition to the House. What happened on that day? Maybe I'll start with you, Minister,
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Eddie, and let me thank you and NCN and your viewers for the great interest that you have shown and continue to show in this very important issue. You ask about the sitting of last Thursday, and in particular about the Private Sector Commission petition. I would say this by way of prefatory remark. What is particularly significant about last Thursday's sitting is that the intentions of the combined opposition as it relates to Guyana, the Guyanese people, development of our country, the well-being of our people, that the intentions of the combined opposition in this regard have been laid bare. They have been unmasked. They have been unmasked as a combined opposition with absolutely no commitment to development, with callous disregard for the views of our people, indeed the views of important stakeholders, and complete lack of concern for the well-being of our citizens. Nowhere and at no point in time was this better illustrated than in their response to the Private Sector Commission. Private Sector Commission, an umbrella body representing perhaps 18 or 19 large sectoral groups along with corporate members, which are essentially the largest companies in Guyana. The organized private sector, representing, for all practical purposes, almost all of the privately owned economy, sought leave to speak to the National Assembly by submitting a petition. This is the only means through which non-members of the National Assembly have access and recourse to the Assembly. There has been precedent for petitions being submitted on matters before a current agenda and being accommodated. Absolutely no harm can emanate from a petition being accommodated on a matter such as this, a petition that didn't contain any defamatory remarks, didn't contain any inflammatory remarks or anything like that, from a sober, level-headed, responsible private sector. And Mr. Webb says here, no doubt he'll speak for himself and for his organization, but I will say this. I was frankly astonished and flabbergasted to hear persons who hold themselves out to be senior members of the opposition argue against the petition being listened to. Mr. Carl Greenidge, who is well known to have been a long-standing opponent of the private sector, recall that he served as finance minister for most of the 1980s when the private sector was decimated and when the entrepreneurial classes were essentially and effectively banished from Guyana. This is the same Mr. Greenidge. Stood up in the parliament and launched an extremely distasteful assault against the Private Sector Commission, insinuating that they were propagandists, disparaging their petition, and arguing passionately that this petition should not be heard, that the private sector should not be given an opportunity to be heard. He was very swiftly and very robustly supported by Mr. Khemraj Ramjattan, who made essentially the same arguments. In fact, rather vulgarly, individual names of certain members of the leadership of the private sector were being bandied and heckled by the opposition. These are people who don't have a direct voice in the National Assembly. They're not members of the National Assembly. They're not politicians. Individual names being identified and heckled and being referred to disparagingly. And Mr. Ramjattan reinforced Mr. Greenidge's arguments. And they used this one-seat tyranny, in my mind, in the most vulgar manner possible on Thursday, by refusing a legitimate, organized stakeholder the opportunity to even speak, the opportunity to be heard, the opportunity to register a view on this. So the opposition cannot claim to be a friend of the private sector. They cannot claim to be supportive of private sector-led growth in Guyana. They cannot claim to be an adherent to or respectful of free speech or democracy. They cannot claim to be accommodative of freedom of expression and open expression of views. Their outright rejection of the Private Sector Commission has unmasked their true nature for those who were previously not convinced.
Mr. Teixeira, you were forced to intervene. I'll come to you, Mr. Webster. I know this is your thing, the petition, but because of the presence of Mr. Teixeira and Minister Singh in the House, I want him to set the stage basically of what happened with the petition. You were forced to intervene, Mrs. Teixeira, at one point as it relates to this petition, and that there were some strange terms and phrases being used to describe the petition itself and the Private Sector Commission.
I mean, first of all, in all parliaments, and from the beginning of what you call the mother of all parliaments, the British Parliament, in, I think it was 1000, I've forgotten the right date, but I think it's 1106. In that very tradition of people coming before the Parliament, ordinary people coming before the Parliament, many in those days people couldn't read and write, to appeal to the Parliament, to hear their plea. That's why the language of a petition is a plea to the parliamentarians, to listen to the petitioners. It is a tradition that's over 1,000 years old, and for the lords and the persons and the squires and ordinary people coming before the Parliament to have their voice heard. And in those days, many people, majority of people, didn't have the right to vote. So that this time-honored tradition to come before the Parliament, to lay a petition to the legislature and the legislators to hear their plea is something that is so sacrosanct, as I said in Parliament, that what was going on in Parliament, as Minister Ashley said, was incomprehensible. And totally unprecedented. And so this right to be heard, and a democratic right, which is now enshrined as a democratic right globally, that the legislature must listen to the voice of the people in a variety of ways, was, I think, incomprehensible in the Parliament. And the fact that it became so nasty, they called the petition malicious, vexatious, inaccurate, made disparaging comments about the signatories to the petition that were Mr. Webster as the head of the private sector and Captain Gavaya. And so this is a very unhealthy environment where a petition was not allowed to be heard. It's never happened in our Parliament, and I can put my head on a block that in most parliaments of the world it just would not happen. And it doesn't matter if the petitioner is pro-government, anti-government. And I remember, as even the Speaker had to comment, that the gambling, the petition that was laid at the same day as the gambling bill was debated, there was a petition from the Christian community, which had made some very, very strong, strident statements in relation to the government and bringing the petition, so that, and it was unthinkable, it would have been unthinkable, and in fact it did not happen. The government did not try to prevent Mrs. Holder, who was the reader on behalf of the petitioners. We didn't block it. It was read word for word, as uncomfortable as it made us, it was read. And there have been other petitioners, the one in the University of Guyana, the most recent one, which was brought by Dr. Rupert Roopnaraine, also made statements that we on the government side find objectionable. We weren't pleased with it. We don't like parts of it. But it was read. At no point did we ever think, it wasn't something that crossed our minds, actually, to get up and say, don't let the petition be read. So in that context, I think the Guyanese public has to see the context of a petition not being read, and a petition coming from a recognized, legitimate body in our country, such as the Private Sector Commission.
Mr. Webster, this is the only opportunity that the private sector, or like Mrs. Shears would have said, average Guyanese would get an opportunity to actually speak to parliamentarians, to make their voices heard, to make certain calls. Mm-hmm. What was your reaction when you heard that, okay, the petition wasn't even read?
Well, my initial reaction was total disgust. It really was horrifying, because as has been pointed out earlier, this is the one opportunity that a group of people have to bring some to the attention of Parliament. The petition was to the Parliament in totality, not to segments of the Parliament. And the Parliament represents the total cross-section of the Guyanese population and thought and ideology and so on. And I think that the reason why, my assumption, the reason why there was an attempt made, well, it wasn't an attempt, that the reading of the document, the petition, was not permitted, was to avoid it going down in history. So if there's a total mess-up of the economy, a year, 2 years down the road, there's no record that the Private Sector Commission had warned that this would happen. I really believe that was one of the reasons. And we're dealing with a very serious issue. And let me backtrack a bit. There is a belief that the Private Sector Commission represents people who are very well off on the top of the bracket in Guyana.
The cream of the cream.
The cream of the cream. However, it's made up of representative groups. The Guyana Gold and Diamond Miners Association, for example, which bridges from very small miners to very large miners. One of the more vibrant private sector groups. You have Forest Products. You have the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce, which bridges very small shop owners as well as a fairly large supermarket owners and so on, commercial businesses. So it's from the smallest individual to the largest corporation. And before we sent that petition out, we made sure that all members of the council, which represent all of these organizations, as well as the corporate groups, were made aware of the document and voted on the document. And what really pleased me more than anything was to see the tremendous positive reaction we got. Now don't forget, the private sector is made up of groups with all different political biases and so on. In any society you'd expect that. So everyone voted for it. Well, let's put it this way, nobody voted against. And I think it was 89% of the membership or 90% of the membership voted for in writing. So that was a truly representative petition. Why did we do that, prepare that petition? We could see what could happen. It's a very, very serious issue. If you're blacklisted, in today's modern economy where you have to take decisions in fractions of a second almost, where you have to move funds, pay for goods in order to get discounted prices swiftly, where if you fail to place an order by a certain time, you probably face 2 or 3 weeks delay in the delivery of goods. Now that's what happens now. And in a developing economy, it's going to be, the demand is going to be swifter and swifter. Now, imagine a situation where it takes weeks to process funds. The whole system slows down. So there's a tremendous concern. This is not political, and not a political issue. This is a matter of growth in the economy or slippage.
Mrs. Teixeira, I want us to move quickly off of the petition itself. Let us look at the report, the Special Select Committee report. And maybe you could talk a little about what transpired during the course of the meetings of the Special Select Committee. You tabled that report in the House.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about the report itself. You can't give us everything that it contained, but maybe a general sense of that and what transpired during the meetings.
The committee met on 17 occasions, and 3 meetings were postponed. At 14 of the 17 meetings, there was opposition representatives or representative. So this whole thing that they were left out, they didn't have inputs, it's not true. The second issue is that the committee worked and produced 81 amendments to bring Guyana in greater compliance. Because remember, there were recommendations made to Guyana, a draft bill was created, it went to the House, it went to committee, and the committee focused on what were the recommendations CFATF made, clause by clause, to see were we in compliance. And where there were weaknesses, we tried to bring all of that into compliance. And that it must not be misunderstood, because the bill, as we made amendments to it, was sent to CFATF. Have we now brought this paragraph? Because no matter when you listen to Mr. Granger talk about we need comprehensive legislation, the public must know this bill was driven by CFATF and FATF to make sure that we were in compliance, that Guyana's deficiencies, we weren't putting the global financial system at risk. In the committee, so 81 amendments were made. We studied different jurisdictions. The DPP came and made presentations, and a number of her recommendations or her amendments were brought into it. The Bankers Association, the Institute of Internal Auditors, for example, their amendments were put in. Remember, we had gone to the public and invited comments. But when you're dealing with a bill, what you're really looking for is amendments. People may have opinions on a bill. They like it, they don't like it, that this section isn't a good section or whatever, or it doesn't comply, or it doesn't say what they wanted to say. But generally, when you're looking at a bill, you're looking for this section needs to be amended the following way to capture what you wanted to say. We received memorandum from Dr. Clive Thomas, a huge memorandum, but basically telling us about money laundering and CFATF and so forth. But there was not one amendment in it or one section that was found that you need to change this. I've heard on the floor and seen in the newspapers a whole discussion on the FIU and that they want to change how the FIU is provided for in law. No one brought an amendment. No one actually focused on that. In fact, the debate on the bill by the opposition took place more in the newspapers than in the committee. So in the committee, at no point did someone bring up from the opposition that we want to change how the FIU is appointed. And in fact, the FIU director is appointed the same way as in many other jurisdictions, Canada, the United States, and so forth. They're appointed by the minister or the secretary of state or the secretary of treasury, right? In a few Caribbean countries, they're appointed by the governor general. So that these are politicians appointing based on the nature of the financial intelligence unit and the link with the government. In looking back, Eddie, looking back, I share the feeling and the way in which Dr. Ashley Singh expressed it when we first began, of being bewildered, baffled, and if you could say that there are many things in life that have created that kind of sense of inability to rationalize what happened. Last night was one of those times, or not last night, November 7th. And I went back in the report and I went through it because I decided to really try to chronicle what happened in my mind. And it was very clear, and Dr. Ashley Singh made it very clear on the floor and put it over very well, the pattern that evolved. It is clear now, the opposition, first of all, didn't want this bill to go through, at no stage. All of this is icing on the cake, is camouflage in a sense. They've got to explain why they did what they did. But they didn't want this bill to go through. When it came to the House to be going to second reading, sent to select committee. When we went to select committee, they dithered. The president made an appeal to them to hurry up. We then went back to the committee. They suddenly, at that point, when in the midst of the president appealing to the House, which is unprecedented, just like the private sector, petition is unprecedented by itself. And the petition being not read is unprecedented. The president of Guyana sending a message to the House appealing to MPs is unprecedented. It's never happened in our parliament. And the dismissal of that by making sure that we meet three weeks later. And on. We missed the deadline of May the 28th. We missed the deadline of August the 26th. And we have missed the deadline, in a sense, they've killed the bill. And yet all the time they were saying, we have until November. We can appeal. Basil Williams blithely saying in the House, you can get another extension. You can appeal again. And in the newspapers. So for me now, having gone through November 7th, that I am now convinced that at no time, did the opposition, and I say APNU and AFC, had any desire that this bill must be passed. At each time it was filibuster in committee to prevent it. And so this whole thing about Teixeira on October the 21st, when they asked for a deferral, should have given them another day or given another week. They knew, because I said to them, there would be no parliamentary committee from October 26th to October 31st because of the Surinamese delegation, which the Guyana Parliament was hosting, and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Regional Meeting, which Guyana was hosting. And so all we had was those few days. And I took the decision, let's meet the next day with the view that I still had one more day if anything happened. So that they came unprepared to meetings. They came unprepared to meetings. When we adopted the report, I'm sorry to go a bit long, but October 22nd, when we decided they didn't come, let's conclude, it was the July 29th version of the draft report and the amendments to the bill. Nothing had changed between July 29th to October 22nd. And so they moved on August 5th that we mustn't meet until committee, so that's another filibuster, prevent us from working. And then having met on the 14th, again trying to filibuster again. And so we made sure we made the corrections and brought the draft report and the bill back to the House. And then we see what happens on the House. And so the issue now is, I'll say this on this interview, I don't want to get NCN in trouble, but my view now is that the leaders of the opposition, APNU, AFC, cannot rationalize anything that has happened. Other we can attack them and criticize them being anti-national and anti-patriotic, but I think they've lost their beans. They're all mad. Because there is no rationalization to explain how could you take a country and put it in jeopardy. This is either the level of my brain cannot go to, which is such level of sinisterism or sinister move, or that they've all lost their beans. They're not there. There's something psychologically wrong. And so it's either sinister, you want to bring the country down, you want to bring the government down, or that they've all have psychiatric problems and need to be medically attended to.
But the whole call during Thursday's sitting, let's go back to the Special Select Committee, bearing in mind the timeline that we have to get this bill passed and presented to CFATF by November 18. Do you think that call was sincere, bearing in mind there was no timeline? Let's work 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, or so.
Eddie, I will say this. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there was no sincerity whatsoever in their suggestion that the bill be recommitted to a select committee.
Yeah.
I agree with Ms. Teixeira when she said that at no time did they ever intend to pass this bill. You can't have had 7 months. This bill was published in April, gazetted in April and tabled in April, read for the first time in April, and committed it to the Select Committee in May. The Select Committee commenced meeting immediately in May, met until October. Met, as Gail said, on 17 occasions, and the government was available to meet every day. Were the government to have had its way, we might have met 1,700 times. We were willing to meet as often and for as long as it took, and the verbatim transcript of the committee's proceedings will reflect this. The opposition's conduct throughout the deliberations of the committee was characterized by a design to delay. On every occasion, they were not available for the next meeting. They were not available to work longer hours. So I agree entirely with Gail in her conclusion that there was never an intent to pass this bill within the deadline. I will say this, that after Thursday's sitting, early on Friday morning, I went to see one of Guyana's most senior politicians, statesmen even, Dr. Ramjattan. And I said to him, well, obviously we were keeping each other apprised. We were all keeping each other apprised. I know that Gail was speaking with him. I spoke with him after the sitting too. So I went to see him on Friday morning, and I saw a look of almost disbelief on his face. And Dr. Ramjattan is somebody for whom I think the entire nation has immense respect, his nationalism, his commitment to Guyana. I saw almost a look of disbelief, and he said to me, you know, my last words at my cabinet press briefing was that I remain eternally in hope.
Yeah, I said the same thing.
That he was optimistic. And he looked at me and he said, with an innocence in his face, and he said to me, are these people, how could they do this? Are these people Guyanese? This was the question Dr. Ramjattan asked with an innocence on his face. I was moved by the question that he asked me and by the emotion in this. He said, up to the last minute, I refused to believe that a Guyanese politician would do this to Guyana, no matter which party they belong to.
Agreed.
If we examine what has been happening since the 10th Parliament, Gail says that she thinks they've lost their beans or their marbles. They're mad. That's one possible interpretation. Another interpretation that has to be given some degree of credibility is that they have a design to destroy Guyana.
Yeah.
And if we examine the pattern of behavior that has made itself evident throughout the 10th Parliament, you will see, to give you just a few examples, you will see cutting of the budget, and in particular cutting of development programs that affect people's lives, hinterland airstrips which affect access to the interior, a specialty hospital which is about providing medical care to your citizens, Amerindian development projects which are about strengthening the Amerindian village economy. Cuts that are completely and totally irrational and unconscionable. Obstructing the Amila Falls project and chasing away one of the world's largest, certainly the largest institutional investor that has ever expressed an interest in Guyana, and essentially attempting to scupper the largest private sector investment in Guyana's history, and an investment that would have changed our lives, reduced the cost of energy and increased the reliability of energy for all of us, attempting to scupper that project. Saying to the investors in the Marriott, we, the APNU, were we to get into government, will not respect contracts executed with you. Saying to the Private Sector Commission, we will not give you a voice on this matter. Your petition will not be heard. And we will obstruct the money laundering legislation no matter what it does to your businesses. But I will say this.
But they went further. They said they don't have a vote.
That is correct.
They don't have a vote.
They said the Private Sector Commission doesn't have a vote in this House. Well, I will tell you what. The Private Sector Commission employs, the membership of the Private Sector Commission employs hundreds of thousands of persons. Those persons have a vote. And well, those are the people who put us in the parliament. Those are the people that gave us a mandate. We represent those people. The PPP is proud to represent those people. Those people's livelihoods are affected, are determined by the prosperity and the prosperity and the performance of the membership of the Private Sector Commission. Private Sector Commission is not only about business. They are the entity that represents the employers of this country. They create the jobs. They generate the incomes. They pay wages and salaries every week and every month. And to say these people don't have a vote in this House, we're not interested in their voice and their opinion, we don't care about how they're going to be affected, we're not going to honor contracts with them. Let the Blackstone Group go back and come back whenever they feel like, and the IDB and the CDB, and dismissing them and saying, they seem to believe that the whole world is going to wait on them to make up their minds. We're not ready to pass this bill. Let's see FATF come back again, go and ask for another deadline. We're not interested in what the Blackstone Group said about their Milo Falls project. Let them go. We will get somebody else will come along and support some imaginary hydropower project in their heads. If you put these pieces together, there is such a clear and distinct pattern of destructive behavior emerging that one has to wonder whether it is madness or a design to destroy. And what can be, were you to attach any credibility to the argument that there's a design to destroy Guyana, you would have to ask yourself why. And I would say this, that this is the ultimate example of wanting to seize political power at all costs. No matter what it does to the Guyanese people, to Guyanese business, to the Guyanese economy, to Guyana's image internationally, no matter what it does to Guyana, they want to make Guyana look bad and do badly with one motive in mind, to displace the People's Progressive Party in government. Given this, given their willingness to place our country at the brink and push us over the precipice, and given their track record when they were themselves in office, recalling that the main architect of a lot of this is Mr. Greenidge, who presided over the destruction of the Guyanese economy in the 1980s, bearing this in mind, I have no doubt that the Guyanese people are watching very closely.
We have just a few minutes remaining, but the implications for Guyana, I can start with you, Mr. Webster. The implications that relates to the non-passage of this bill.
Well, it affects all aspects of the economy. The transmission of funds, probably one of the areas which is a considerable concern, but it also impacts on security as well, is the remittances from relatives abroad. Now, these remittances come to small people, poor people. Some are totally dependent on receiving those remittances to put their children through high school, to get daily things for them. It will delay it. It'll make it more expensive. It's most unfortunate that there was a seminar that was sponsored by the Canadians initially, and the Private Sector Commission were co-hosts. This was some months ago. And there was a presentation done there by the head of the division in Trinidad, because Trinidad was grey-listed at one stage, or blacklisted.
Yeah, it was. It was a non-cooperation country.
And the lady who was in charge of that group made a plea. Please do not let this happen to Guyana. It was a tremendous effort to get out of it. Trinidad had the advantage that they have oil, the oil wealth. They have the large oil companies to assist them in moving forward and getting out of this trap. If you take Antigua, Antigua is blacklisted. As far as I know, they still are, 5 years down the road, because they don't have that power. We have got to be very, very careful that we don't get stuck in a trap which turns this economy into an absolute mess. And I must stress this, that the Minister of Finance has already mentioned it. The private sector grows as wealth is generated. The more disposable income people have, the greater the market opportunities, the greater the forward movement, the greater the development of the economy. Disposable income allows people to buy houses, to buy appliances, to create a decent life. But it seems to me that there is an ideology which is pushing us back to state ownership. This is the concern for a lot of members of the private sector. And if that concern becomes really serious, they're going to start moving capital. And that is another concern that we have. So this issue of a money laundering bill and anti-terrorism bill is not a simple issue. It pervades every aspect of our daily lives. And we've got to take it very, very seriously. It's sad. But if we look back in our history, we have a very young private sector. Because 20-odd years ago, it was state ownership. Everything was held by the state. This economy has only developed and moved at the rate it has with an increase in private investment. And we must keep that momentum going.
Minister and then Mrs. Teixeira.
Well, Like I said, Eddie, in my mind, the conclusions about the opposition's intent are very clear as of last Thursday. I would say equally so, this government remains firmly committed to doing all that we can to preserve the environment for doing business, to continue to make enhancements to that environment so that investors can find it easier to do business in Guyana, less costly to do business in Guyana. We will not relent in this effort, including indeed by making the case to CFATF. We will be participating in the plenary meeting of the CFATF in later this month, I think, starting from the 18th of November. 17th or 18th of November. And on that occasion, as on every previous occasion, we will make the case, we will outline government's efforts to implement the recommendations that were made, and I believe those efforts were, governmental efforts were as substantial as one could reasonably expect them to be. They were. I really don't think that there was much more than government could have been reasonably expected to do. And so we will outline our efforts in trying to bring Guyana in a position where we would have implemented all of the recommendations. We will explain the challenges that we faced in Parliament. It remains, of course, to be seen how CFATF will respond to that and how they will react to that. And then we'll take it from there. But in the meantime, I will say that I have no doubt that the international community is watching. I have no doubt that investors are watching, the private sector, and I have no doubt that the citizens are watching and forming their own assessments about who amongst the various contestants for political space in Guyana, who amongst those is sincere about taking Guyana forward, and who amongst those is willing to take Guyana to the brink and to the precipice to achieve their own narrow political objectives. I think the conclusions, the answers to those questions are relatively evident given recent developments.
Mrs. Teixeira, what could be done now? Is there any window that we could at least do something to get this bill through? We have just about a week and something.
The voice
more.
of the people. The voice of the people. That I think that Guyanese people, maybe we need to come together in some form to make our voices known, whether in petitions, resolutions, some form. To the CFATF. No, forget about Parliament. Forget about the Guyana Parliament. We're sidestepping that one. We know the answer what's going to happen there. Let's go to CFATF. Let's have telegrams or emails or petitions or resolutions. Let the Guyanese people, labor, private sector, religious bodies, women's organizations, help us to say to CFATF, look, this is here are the voices of the Guyanese people, and we can't stop what happened in Parliament, but we want CFATF to know that the legitimate voices of the people of our country are not in support of what happened in Parliament, and they were saying to CFATF, this country cannot go down. I'm not saying it'll work, but the voice of our people, the fact that, I as both gentlemen were talking, I was thinking about when Mr. Trotman began Parliament, in the 10th Parliament, that this is going to be a Parliament of a difference, and I've had to think back about what this difference means. It's come back, I think, to slap him in the face, actually, because it's becoming a Parliament which is unprecedented in what it is doing and unraveling so many aspects of our country's life. Forget about standing orders and stuff like that, or rulings and whatever else has happened. But I just was thinking when you, Minister, was talking about August 7th and the debate on Amila, and we had to bring back Amila because July 18th they'd killed it, and we had to go and the Speaker agreed with us to bring back it, and which isn't allowed in Parliament, and we had to get waivers and suspension, all sorts of procedural things. Came back on August the 7th. The bill is passed, etc., etc. But a mile is basically killed because it required all of us to be together for the benefit of our country, and they don't seem to have learned. Between August 7th to November 7th, nothing changed. What changed? They came back in the same Parliament, the same bullyism. You give us this or you don't get this. So the whole thing, we don't care how good the bill is. If you don't give us this, you don't give us this, you don't get this. Now, contrast that with the Trinidad Parliament, as you were pointing out. I went and read the Hansard of the Trinidad debate on their money laundering. They were on the nth hour in 2011. They either got the bill through or Trinidad was in worse crisis. What was fascinating about reading the debate, this is, I think, Manning was the Prime Minister. So it was a parliament that was very controversial with very strong emotions on all sides, and Kamala's side and Manning, and they were on the eve, I think, before the elections and stuff like that. The Trinidad Parliament won. Only one person in the entire Parliament voted against it, an independent. Every man jack. Every MP of both sides of the House supported all the bills, because it wasn't just one bill like ours. There were several amendments they had to bring to several bills. Secondly, was that in the debate on the Trinidad at the time, you had members of Parliament getting up and talking about that the impact of people trying to get their remittances, what was happening with insurance. It was almost deja vu reading it and saying, this is what's going to happen, this is what's already happening here, where the people are complaining of the length of time and the number of documentation, and we haven't been even listed as yet.
Yeah.
And so May, from the time May came and we missed that deadline, flags started to go up with Guyana. And so banks started taking measures. And so by November, and we explained this, Minister Ashney in the committee, the October 14th meeting of the committee, at which 4 of the 5 members of Parliament were there, went to great pains to explain what the private sector was experiencing with doing business in Guyana. And we're not even listed yet. So August 7th, August 9th, no change. They're more belligerent and more intransigent than they were even on August the 7th. And that my view is that the voice of the people, let the women's groups and the youth groups and the trade movement and the private sector and religious groups, if you don't want to send it to government, don't send it to government. Send straight to CFATF. Send your resolutions, your petitions, your call to CFATF. You don't have to go through us. We have a delegation going. We've got to do as best as we can. But let CFATF know that the APNU and AFC are against the tide of the international standards and the global issues to do with financial transactions, and they're against the national tide. They're pitted themselves against every single legitimate civil bodies in this society. And so it's now time for the voice of the people.
Dr. Ashley Singh, Madam Teixeira, and Mr. Webster, I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this discussion, and I want to thank you very much for joining us. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Thank you.